Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! The old house creaked and groaned, settling into its foundation as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through dusty windows. Landon stood in the doorway of Aunt Clara's bedroom, his hand resting on the worn brass doorknob. He took a deep breath, inhaling the lingering scent of lavender and old books that had always permeated her living space. "Well, here goes nothing," he muttered to himself, stepping into the room. The task ahead felt daunting. Clearing out Aunt Clara's belongings wasn't just a chore, it was like dismantling a life full of memories, eccentricities, and secrets. Landon's eyes swept across the cluttered space, taking in the mismatched furniture, colorful throw pillows, and walls adorned with an eclectic mix of artwork. He started with the dresser, methodically emptying drawers and sorting items into boxes labeled Keep, Donate, and Trash. As he worked, his mind wandered to memories of Aunt Clara, her infectious laugh, her bold fashion choices, and the way she always encouraged him to be himself, even when he didn't quite know who that was. Hours passed, and Landon found himself lost in the task, surrounded by piles of clothing and knickknacks. He was about to call it a day when something caught his eye, a corner of an ornate trunk peeking out from beneath a mountain of scarves and shawls. "What have we here?" He wondered aloud, carefully moving the fabric aside. The trunk was beautiful, its wood dark and richly grained, with brass fittings that glinted in the fading light. Landon ran his fingers over the intricate carvings on the lid, marveling at the craftsmanship. With a mix of curiosity and reverence, he lifted the heavy lid. What he found inside took his breath away. The trunk was filled to the brim with the most exquisite collection of vintage clothing and accessories he had ever seen. Delicate lace gloves lay nestled next to vibrant silk scarves, a string of pearls draped over the edge of a hat box, and at the center of it all, carefully folded, was a stunning gown that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. Landon carefully lifted the dress from the trunk, holding it up to examine it more closely. It was a masterpiece of design, a flowing, floor-length gown in a rich emerald green. The bodice was adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the light, creating a dazzling display. The skirt fell in graceful folds, promising to swirl and sway with every movement. "Oh, Aunt Clara," Landon whispered, a lump forming in his throat. "You really were something else." He knew his aunt had always been bold in her fashion choices, but this collection was beyond anything he had imagined. Each piece seemed to radiate personality and confidence, traits that Landon had always admired in Aunt Clara, but struggled to embody himself. Without really thinking about what he was doing, Landon found himself holding the dress up to his body, looking at his reflection in the full-length mirror on the closet door. The contrast between the vibrant, flowing gown and his plain jeans and t-shirt was striking. A thought crept into his mind, one that both thrilled and terrified him. What if... Before he could talk himself out of it, Landon was stripping off his clothes. With trembling hands, he slipped the dress over his head, letting the cool fabric cascade down his body. It took some adjusting. The dress was clearly designed for a more feminine figure, but eventually, he managed to settle it into place. Landon turned to face the mirror, and his breath caught in his throat. The person staring back at him was transformed. The gown hugged his body in ways he never would have expected, accentuating curves he didn't know he had. The color made his skin glow and brought out flecks of green in his hazel eyes. But it wasn't just the physical transformation that stunned him. There was something in his posture, in the way he held himself, that was different. He stood taller, his shoulders back, chin lifted. For the first time in his life, Landon felt beautiful. A rush of exhilaration coursed through him, setting his nerves alight. He twirled experimentally, watching as the skirt flared out around him. A laugh bubbled up from his chest, surprising him with its lightness. "Is this how you felt, Aunt Clara?" he asked the empty room. "Is this why you always seemed so free?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but resonant. Landon found himself drawn back to the trunk, fingers trailing over the other treasures it held. A makeup case caught his eye, a vintage affair with gold clasps and a mirrored lid. With a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, he opened it. Inside, he found an array of cosmetics, some clearly well-loved, and others barely touched. His hand hovered over the contents before finally selecting a tube of deep red lipstick and an eyeliner pencil. Landon had never applied makeup before, but he'd watched Aunt Clara do it countless times. He remembered how she would sit at her vanity, transforming herself with practiced ease. Taking a deep breath, he uncapped the lipstick and brought it to his lips. The first stroke was clumsy, leaving an uneven line, but as he continued, his hand steadied. He filled in his lips carefully, pressing them together to distribute the color evenly. Next came the eyeliner, which he applied with painstaking care, trying to mimic the elegant flicks he'd seen Aunt Clara create. When he finally looked up at his reflection again, Landon barely recognized himself. The person in the mirror was a blend of familiar and foreign, his features, but enhanced, emphasized. The bold red lips and dark-lined eyes created a striking contrast with his fair skin, but it was more than just the physical changes. There was a sparkle in his eyes that he'd never seen before, a confidence in his gaze that both thrilled and frightened him. This version of himself, adorned in Aunt Clara's gown and makeup, felt more authentic than the person he'd been pretending to be for years. Landon's mind raced with memories of Aunt Clara, her unwavering support, her gentle encouragement to be true to himself. Had she known? Had she seen this part of him that he'd kept hidden, even from himself? He thought back to all the times she'd invited him to try on her jewelry or hats, how she'd playfully draped scarves around his shoulders. At the time, he'd laughed it off, too self-conscious to fully engage. But now, standing here in her bedroom, wrapped in her dress and wearing her makeup, Landon wondered if those moments had been Aunt Clara's way of giving him permission to explore. A sob caught in his throat, equal parts grief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty room, to the memory of the woman who had always seen him more clearly than he'd seen himself. Landon spent the next hour exploring the contents of the trunk, trying on different pieces and combinations. He draped himself in strings of pearls, slipped on elbow-length gloves, and perched ornate hats atop his head. With each new addition, he felt a little bolder, a little more at ease in this newfound expression of himself. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, Landon found himself drawn to Aunt Clara's vanity. He sat down carefully, mindful of the delicate fabric of the dress, and looked at himself in the triptych mirror. The person staring back at him was a revelation. Gone was the reserved, almost timid man he'd been that morning. In his place was someone vibrant, confident, alive. Landon realized with a start that this was how he'd always seen Aunt Clara, as someone who fully inhabited her own skin, unapologetic in her uniqueness. He picked up a brush and began to run it through his hair, remembering how Aunt Clara used to brush and style his hair when he was young. She'd always lamented that he kept it so short, insisting that he had such lovely waves if he'd only let them grow out. As he brushed, Landon found himself humming a tune, an old jazz standard that Aunt Clara used to play on her record player. The familiar melody filled the room, and for a moment, He could almost hear her voice joining in, could almost feel her presence beside him. "What do you think, Aunt Clara?" he asked softly, meeting his own gaze in the mirror. "Is this what you saw when you looked at me?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, but not unacknowledged. Landon set the brush down and leaned closer to the mirror, examining his reflection more closely. He could see traces of Aunt Clara in the curve of his smile, in the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. But more than that, he saw a version of himself that felt true, a self he'd kept hidden for far too long. A noise from downstairs startled him out of his reverie. Probably just the old house settling, but it was enough to remind him of the world outside this room. Landon glanced at the clock on the bedside table and was shocked to see how much time had passed. He stood, smoothing down the skirt of the dress, and took one last look at himself in the full-length mirror. The person who looked back at him was both familiar and strange, a perfect blend of Landon and someone new. With a deep breath, he began to carefully remove the dress, folding it with reverence before placing it back in the trunk. He wiped off the makeup, watching as the bold, confident face in the mirror faded back into his usual appearance. But something had changed, irrevocably. He could feel it in the way he held himself, in the lingering sense of liberation that clung to him like a perfume. As he closed the lid of the trunk, Landon made a silent promise to himself and to Aunt Clara. This wouldn't be the end. This exploration, this revelation, was just the beginning. He finished cleaning up the room, his movements more purposeful now, energized by his discovery. As he worked, he began to formulate a plan. He would finish clearing out the house, yes, but he would also carve out a space for himself, a place where he could continue to explore this newfound aspect of his identity. The sun had long since set by the time Landon locked up the house and stepped out into the cool evening air. As he walked to his car, he felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't even known he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. He paused with his hand on the car door, looking back at Aunt Clara's house. In the gathering darkness, it seemed to glow with possibility. "Thank you, Aunt Clara," he said softly, "for everything." As he drove home, Landon's mind was awash with thoughts and plans. He knew that what had happened in that room was just the first step on a long journey of self-discovery. There would be challenges ahead, questions to answer, both for himself and others. But for the first time in his life, Landon felt truly excited about the future. He thought about the trunk, safely stored in Aunt Clara's bedroom. It wasn't just a collection of beautiful clothes and accessories. It was a legacy, a gift from a woman who had always encouraged him to be true to himself. Landon knew he would return to it, to continue exploring this newly awakened part of himself. As he pulled into his driveway, Landon caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. Though the makeup was gone and he was back in his everyday clothes, there was something different in his eyes, a spark of confidence, of self-awareness that hadn't been there before. He smiled at his reflection, a full, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Hello," he said softly, as if introducing himself to this new version of Landon. "It's nice to finally meet you." With that, he got out of the car and headed into his house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, but for now, Landon was content in the knowledge that he had taken the first step on a journey that would change his life forever. As he prepared for bed that night, Landon found himself standing in front of his own mirror, studying his reflection. He could still feel the ghost of the dress against his skin, could still see the echo of that bold, confident person he'd glimpsed in Aunt Clara's bedroom. He ran a hand through his hair, remembering how it had felt to brush it at the vanity. On an impulse, he reached for his phone and pulled up the contact information for his usual barber. "I think it's time for a change," he murmured to himself as he typed out a message canceling his upcoming appointment. He'd been getting the same short, conservative haircut for years, a style that was safe, unremarkable. But now, the idea of letting his hair grow out, of embracing those waves Aunt Clara had always admired, filled him with a sense of anticipation. As he set his phone aside and climbed into bed, Landon's mind drifted back to the trunk and its contents. He knew he would have to be careful. His small town wasn't exactly known for its open-mindedness, but the thought of keeping this part of himself locked away, now that he'd discovered it, was unbearable. He began to formulate a plan. He would return to Aunt Clara's house tomorrow, ostensibly to continue clearing it out. But his real purpose would be to spend more time with the trunk and its treasures. He would practice applying makeup, experiment with different styles of clothing, and see how they made him feel. As he drifted off to sleep, Landon's dreams were filled with swirling fabrics, glittering jewelry, and the sound of Aunt Clara's laughter. For the first time in years, he slept deeply and peacefully, unburdened by the weight of unacknowledged truths. The next morning, Landon woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He went through his usual routine, shower, shave, breakfast, but everything felt different. As he sipped his coffee, he found himself imagining how it would feel to sit at a cafe table, legs crossed elegantly, lipstick leaving a perfect imprint on the rim of the cup. He shook his head, smiling at his own flights of fancy, but the image lingered, tantalizing in its possibility. As he prepared to leave for Aunt Clara's house, Landon paused in front of the mirror in his entryway. His reflection looked back at him, familiar features, unremarkable clothes. But there was something different in his eyes now, a glimmer of the person he'd glimpsed yesterday. "Baby steps," he told his reflection. "We'll get there." The drive to Aunt Clara's house seemed shorter than usual, his anticipation making the familiar route fly by. As he pulled into the driveway, Landon felt a flutter of excitement in his stomach. He knew that behind that front door, a world of possibility awaited him. He let himself in, the house quiet and still in the morning light. Without hesitation, he made his way upstairs to Aunt Clara's bedroom. The trunk sat where he'd left it, looking for all the world like an ordinary piece of furniture, but Landon knew better now. With reverent hands, he opened the lid. The contents seemed to glow in the sunlight streaming through the windows, each piece a promise of transformation. Landon ran his fingers over the fabrics, relishing their textures: smooth silk, soft velvet, delicate lace. He selected a blouse this time, a flowing, feminine piece in a soft lavender color. It was different from the bold statement of yesterday's gown, but no less thrilling. As he slipped it on over his t-shirt, Landon marveled at how the fabric draped over his body, softening his angular frame. Next came a long, flowing skirt in a complementary shade. It swished around his legs as he moved, the sensation both foreign and exhilarating. Landon twirled experimentally, watching the fabric billow out around him. He approached the vanity with more confidence today, selecting a lighter shade of lipstick and a softer eyeliner. His hands were steadier as he applied the makeup, remembering the techniques he'd observed Aunt Clara using countless times. When he finally looked at his full reflection, Landon felt a surge of joy. The person in the mirror was undeniably him, but softer, more open. The lavender brings out flecks of color in his eyes that he'd never noticed before, and the flowing fabrics gave his movements a grace he'd always envied in others. "Well, hello there," he said softly to his reflection. a smile playing at his lips. Landon spent the next few hours exploring different combinations, gaining confidence with each new outfit. He discovered a talent for accessorizing, learning how a simple scarf or piece of jewelry could completely transform a look. As the afternoon wore on, Landon found himself sitting at Aunt Clara's vanity, idly brushing his hair. He thought about the decision he'd made last night to let it grow out and felt a thrill of anticipation. It would take time, but he could already imagine how it would look, framing his face in soft waves. A noise from outside startled him out of his reverie, a car door slamming. Panic seized him for a moment before he remembered that the house sat well back from the road, hidden by a screen of trees. Still, it was a stark reminder that the outside world existed, that he couldn't stay in this cocoon of self-discovery forever. With a sigh, Landon began to carefully remove the clothes and makeup. But, as he folded each piece and placed it back in the trunk, he made a silent promise to himself. This wouldn't be the last time. He would find a way to incorporate this newfound part of himself into his everyday life, even if it had to be in small, subtle ways at first. As he prepared to leave, Landon's eyes fell on a small jewelry box he hadn't noticed before. Inside, he found a delicate silver chain with a small pendant, a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized it as a piece Aunt Clara had worn often. Without hesitation, Landon fastened the necklace around his neck. The pendant nestled just below the hollow of his throat, a secret talisman of transformation. He tucked it under his shirt, feeling the cool metal against his skin, a constant reminder of this day, of the journey he was embarking on. As he locked up the house and headed to his car, Landon felt different. He stood taller, moved with more confidence. The world looked brighter somehow, full of possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider before. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be questions to answer, challenges to face. But for the first time in his life, Landon felt truly alive, truly himself. And he knew, deep in his heart, that Aunt Clara would be proud. As he drove home, the butterfly pendant a comforting weight against his chest, Landon began to plan. Small steps at first, growing out his hair, incorporating more color into his wardrobe. But someday, he promised himself, he would find the courage to fully embrace this part of himself, to step out into the world as the person he'd discovered in Aunt Clara's bedroom. The sun was setting as Landon pulled into his driveway, casting the world in a warm, golden glow. As he got out of the car, he paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. A sense of peace washed over him, along with a fierce determination. "Thank you, Aunt Clara," he whispered to the fading light. "I won't let you down." With that, Landon walked into his house, ready to begin the next chapter of his life, a life lived authentically, courageously, and with the bold spirit that Aunt Clara had always seen in him.
Thanks for watching, my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!